It's now my pleasure to introduce our presiding officer, the president of the very busy president lately of the Adcraft Club of Detroit, who is the vice president of corporate research and reporting for the Daimler Chrysler Corporation. Please welcome Christine McKenzie.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here. We have a very exciting program for you today. But there are a few remarks I would like to make beforehand, and of course the most prevalent one is for those of you who attended the Cannes Festival last evening. Thank you so much for being there. Last night was certainly super, and definitely for a great cause, as most of you would certainly know that the proceeds do go to our Adcraft Scholarship Fund. And in a couple of months, we will be awarding $25,000 in scholarships to some very deserving college students, and all because of the Cannes Gala. Thanks to all of you who were there last night at the Cannes Gala, and again, especially thank you to USA Today for all the work they did in sponsoring that activity. Next year will be our 100th anniversary. The Adcraft Club of Detroit will have been around for 100 years. And of course we're working very diligently to put together a wonderful program for you all to celebrate the centennial. What I would like to do now is introduce our head table. And from my right, your left, we have a media planner from GM Planworks, and of course a member of the Adcraft PM Committee, Adcrafter Colin Thomas. Welcome, Colin. Next to Colin is the Director of Underwriting and Corporate Support at Michigan Radio, Adcrafter Tom Wright. Welcome, Tom. I will, of course, leave our guest until later. You've already met our newscaster from Michigan Radio, Bill Pullman. Welcome, Bill, and thank you. And, of course, last but certainly not least is our Executive Director of the Adcraft Club, someone who I could not do without for sure, Bob Barini. So I'm sure a lot of you do listen to the BBC NewsHour, and I certainly want to thank the people from Michigan Radio in Ann Arbor for arranging Claire to be here with us today. As the host of the BBC NewsHour, Claire Balderson brings Americans a unique and informed international perspective on the news of the day. I think that we all can appreciate the fact that we certainly kind of think that America is the center of the world, and no one understands our country like we do. But if you ever travel, you will find, I'm sure, that there are many different perspectives on American life. And Claire has the ability, because of her travels and where she comes from, to bring that to Americans and just let us know how other people think about us. Claire began her journalism career as a correspondent with the BBC and Financial Times, reporting from Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Burma. She also spent several years at the BBC Washington Bureau before returning to England in 1997. She now splits her time between BBC Radio and BBC World Services, while always presenting the World News Tonight and BBC NewsHour each twice a week. And by the way, this is Claire's first visit to Michigan. She was telling me that she's visited 30 states in America and never been to Michigan before. I was a little disappointed with the weather. I assured her that things are really much brighter and nicer here in Michigan than what she's seeing today. But fortunately, she was here yesterday and saw our beautiful weather yesterday. So how about a big Adcraft welcome for Claire Balderson.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a very unusual experience for me to be able to see my audience. I sit in a studio day in and day out, and I don't see anyone except the producers around me, and it's quite easy to forget sometimes that you're actually talking to people. It's a little difficult to forget it when they're all sitting here eagerly awaiting my words of wisdom and the message I bring you from Britain about your election. First of all, thank you very much to Michigan Radio, to Tom and the rest of the team for bringing me over here to do this, and to meet lots of people in a very short, action-packed 2 days that I'm having here. And most importantly, for carrying BBC World Service programmes, NewsHour every morning at 9 o'clock, and The World Today, which is run through the night. Without stations like Michigan Radio, we wouldn't be on the air in the US, because you people don't listen to shortwave radio, and that's our only way of getting to our audience unless FM radio stations pick us up. So that's how we get to you. So thank you, Michigan Radio. I'm going to start by talking a little about World Service and about our growing audience in the United States. For decades, we have been used to near cult status in parts of the world at BBC World Service. Eastern Europe, of course, for years desperately needed what we did because people in Eastern Europe and Russia had no way of getting any independent news, any news from outside their government, except through listening to shortwave radio, often clandestinely, often the Russian authorities jamming it, but people would still try by any means to listen. We were the only source of news free of government control. We've always had a devoted audience in Africa, again, because there were limited sources of news for people in developing African nations, where they had government stations, but no history, no tradition of any other kind of radio. South Asia was very similar. That's changed somewhat. Our audience in India, which was once so large and so devoted that Rajiv Gandhi actually learned of his own mother's assassination while listening to a shortwave radio World Service broadcast while he was shaving in the morning. That unfortunately has changed somewhat because people have switched to television in India and other parts of Asia. And in India in particular, which was this massive audience, the government there bans foreign broadcasters from broadcasting on FM. So we've lost a lot of our audience there. But we do still have a devoted audience in much of the world. It can have some rather alarming consequences, as my colleague Julian Marshall, who also anchors Newshour, found when he went to Uganda. And he was doing broadcasting a town hall meeting from a small town in Uganda, and an elderly fisherman had walked for a day and a night to this town to meet Julian, because he'd heard Julian so many times broadcasting through Africa. And when he met him, he threw his arms around his neck and burst into tears, which is very, very touching. And I've had similar experiences in East Timor in the early 1990s when there was a lot of Indonesian oppression, and people were very frightened and very anxious about what was going to happen to them. And I went to visit a convent that I'd been to before, and the nuns there threw open the door and threw their arms around me and said, "Thank God you have come, because we need to tell the BBC about what's happening here," which is very humbling indeed, and it makes you realise the power and the importance of what we do. There's a slightly comical side to it as well, which includes the offers of marriage that I've had. One from a Moroccan who found a copy of the BBC's magazine lying on a park bench in Rabat and sent me a letter saying that he considers himself a rather good catch with 3 camels and some cattle, and would I consider this as an offer? I hasten to add that I turned it down. More recently, I've been getting letters exactly once a month from a gentleman in the Caribbean, in Montego Bay, who is most insistent that not only should I marry him, but that we have an understanding of some sort. And he's rather upset by the fact that I don't seem to be responding to this and haven't set the date or talked about when I'm going to be joining him in the Caribbean. So I think that relationship is going to come to an end soon. But it gives you an idea of how intense people feel about the radio station they're listening to and about the people who are talking to them. And it does remind you of how closely these listeners do follow what you say and what you do. I have not had any such offers, I hasten to add, in the United States, much to my husband's relief, I'm sure, because I do spend a lot of time here. But we are now getting an incredible response to our programmes here. We're carried on more than 400 different NPR stations all over the country, and our audience, we believe, has gone from something like 2.2 million in the year 2000 to nearly 5 million this year. So that's a big increase, and I never thought I would see that. In 1993 to 97, when I was here as a correspondent for the BBC based in Washington, I used to have to spell out who the BBC were when I went to try and get interviews with people. I used to have to say it's the British Broadcasting Corporation, because people just didn't know who we were. And I used to joke that I only got interviews because I sounded like Emma Thompson. And I think that people expected a woman in crinoline skirts straight out of Masterpiece Theatre to appear. And I got quite far on that. It lasted quite a long time. It didn't do me too badly, but that's no longer the case. I've just spent nearly a month here covering the election, and I was in Oregon and Colorado and Ohio. And everywhere I found people who listened and they loved what we did, and it was very gratifying indeed. The reason why, I think, is because what we offer first and foremost is global news with a global perspective, and especially since September the 11th here, there has been a growing interest in the world beyond US shores and America's place in that world. This is all very good that we have this audience here that is growing, and I think will continue to grow, but it does pose new challenges in reporting this country to the United States, to the people of the United States. We have an audience for our English language service of around 40 million people worldwide. The World Service broadcasts in 42 different languages, and so our total audience for World Service is something like 150 million. But in the English language, it's about 40 million. And then we have 5 million in the United States. So anything we do from here and about here really has to be geared to people who live in other countries who don't know much about the United States. On the other hand, we have to give you something as well. If you're tuning in on Michigan Radio at 9 o'clock in the morning, you don't want to hear something that is patronising or something that you already know or something that you can get from your own broadcast. We have to be credible in the United States, and we have to be different from your national broadcasters, or why would you bother tuning to us? At the same time, we have to be as good as your national broadcasters, without, it has to be said, the same kind of access to the corridors of power that they have. So I'll talk a little bit about how we go about it and how we went about it in the election before I talk about some of the reactions to that. I was the main anchor on the road for nearly a month as elections approached. We have a large bureau in Washington. They covered a lot of the daily news, and they covered the campaigns, some of the main issues. They did pieces on religion in politics, on healthcare, and in the final week of the campaign, someone travelled with John Kerry and someone travelled with George Bush, so that we had the daily stuff from the campaign. What my editor, Mike Finnerty, and I set out to do was to try and illustrate the feelings and the emotions of the ordinary American people in their own voices, to talk to as many people as we could, and try and find out what they were thinking and what made them tick. We've developed a sort of unofficial policy of only talking to ordinary people, the man or the woman in the street, as it's sometimes known, not to talk to pundits, to analysts and people who are interpreting it for us, because what's the point of having someone else tell you what people are thinking if you can get it from them directly? We also talked to players, to people who were influencing the election, and to local politicians. We did a long sit-down interview with the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Denver, for example, who'd been very vocal about abortion, which he said was the most important issue on which people should vote in the election. My main aim was then to just sort of get this kind of picture of America through the eyes of Americans for our whole audience worldwide, because all over the world there are huge prejudices and stereotypes about the United States. And those stereotypes and prejudices exist within this country as well. So what I was saying to a French audience or to an African audience, to an Asian audience, was really exactly the same as what I felt that people in some parts of the United States needed to know about as well, or at least needed to hear a bit about, because what I was finding was that very often people from the two sides just weren't talking to each other, just didn't connect at all. People weren't hearing the voices of the other side. So that's what we concentrated on trying to really explain that, yes, this is a polarised country, but it's much more complex than that within both camps there are different subtleties and nuances and varieties of opinion that really shaded the way people were thinking about voting. That yes, you did find the people who were passionately pro-George Bush, but you also found those who supported him on a number of issues but were very anxious about the war. Similarly, you found people who wanted to vote for John Kerry and would consider themselves Democrats but weren't quite sure that he had an answer to what was happening in Iraq and would leave this country any better. That there was a subtlety of opinion that needed to be conveyed to a global audience and throughout the United States as well. We talked to individual voters, as I say. We also did features on the African American vote, whether Kerry could count on support from the African American community. We looked at the gay marriage amendments at Congress. We covered the Senate race in Colorado, just to point out to our audience that this wasn't just about the presidency, it was about Congress as well. All the time trying to bring the world, including America, the point of views that you don't often hear, with the notable exception of NPR in this country. The broadcast media tends to concentrate on the machinery of politics rather than on the voters themselves and what they're feeling. It concentrates on the who's in and who's out in the campaign, which soundbite was better than which soundbite, and of course the polls, endlessly the polls. And I have to say, I don't think the polls told us anything at all. I don't think we learned anything from that. And also in this country, everything has to be very brief, because it has to be done in a soundbite, it has to be over in a minute and a half. If a piece on healthcare makes it onto the evening network newses, it will never be longer than 2 minutes long. Some of my pieces ran for 10 minutes or so. We let them breathe because we felt that people needed to be heard, they needed to explain themselves. And in the words of one of my bosses at World Service, what we did was we used the election here as a big examination of what the US is and who the people are. What we also tried to do was to bring our global audience and you what the rest of the world was thinking about the election and why it mattered so much to so many people, because it really did matter. People are always interested in the United States. They may often regard it with some disdain and talk critically about the US. But America dominates their lives, from Hollywood to Coca-Cola to Nike to whatever it is. America is the global economic, military and cultural power. And we all recognise that, even if quite a lot of the time people don't like it at all. They do recognise it. And more significantly, America and what it does has a huge impact on everyone's lives. The BBC diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus told me recently that the US is the only country in the world that has to have a foreign policy on everywhere and everything. The Europeans, for example, we don't have to worry that much if we annoy China by selling weapons to Taiwan, which we do all the time. What we're worried about is how much money are we going to make, and if we did upset China, well, okay, it would upset China, but it would soon blow over. The US has to consider the nuance of everything it does, because it can't upset not just China, but any country in the world. It has to be very careful. It has to have a foreign policy. If it snubs someone, there has to be a reason why, and that goes all the way down to tiny Fiji and Samoa and countries like that now participating in the coalition in Iraq. I think they even have soldiers there. They've certainly lent support. Well, the US has to have a policy on Fiji and Samoa, even if only they've got a few thousand people. We spend a lot of money on getting people to the places that would be directly impacted by the election and its results. Yes, this was an American story, but perhaps more than at any time in recent memory, it was a truly global story. And what we tried to do, using our vast network of correspondents around the world, and our considerable in-house expertise, was to reflect that and show people that that was the case. It was the same on election night. We did 24 hours of rolling news coverage anchored from Washington, with me in Columbus, Ohio, doing injects from there. But as soon as the results were known, we had reaction from Paris and from Cairo and from other parts of the world. What were people saying? What were they thinking? So that's a little bit about our approach, how we go about reporting the United States and the election in particular. And when I got back to London, after nearly a month away, I suddenly realised that there had been this incredible horror at the result of the election. And not just in London, in Europe generally. And you may have heard of the attempts by the Guardian newspaper, a left-wing British newspaper, to try and influence the vote in Ohio by getting its readers to write to individual voters in Clark County, urging them to vote for Kerry, which was possibly one of the most stupid things I've ever heard of, because of course it backfired. I mean, you know, what American wants to be told by a British person, you should vote like this because. Why is this? Well, there's a number of complex reasons, and I think first and foremost because we do have a slightly different cultural tradition in Europe, considerably more liberal. We have very strict gun control laws. We have no death penalty. You can't join the European Union if you have the death penalty. We have a much stronger welfare state. So traditions much more from the liberal left than from the conservative right. Religion is playing less and less part in politics, whereas I think we've all seen here that it's perhaps playing an increasing part in politics. In Spain, the new socialist government there has made a big effort to push the Catholic Church out of politics and cultural life. In Spain and in Britain, laws are going through Parliament at the moment on civil unions for same-sex partners. So you can see there's a very different approach and different tradition there. Having said that, I think in Europe we're a little bit guilty of assuming a certain sort of moral superiority that has a limited basis in reality, and that comes perhaps from the fact that we still haven't got over the fact we don't have an empire anymore, and America's got it and we haven't. And I think we are a little bit disingenuous. We tend to think, well, you know, who are the Americans to tell everyone what to do? They're a very young country and they're very arrogant, and how dare they? We should be doing it because we're Europeans and we've done it for hundreds of years and we know how to. And I think there's a certain element to that, certainly in Britain and France, perhaps less so in Germany because of its experiences in the war. So back to what happened here, and the sort of strange attitudes that there are in Europe in particular. We didn't recognise, I don't think people in our part of the world recognise that simply changing the man at the top in the United States wouldn't necessarily change everything in the world. It wouldn't necessarily have made a great deal of difference. One of the last pieces I did before Election Day was about John Kerry's biggest problem, which I think was John Kerry. In Europe and in other parts of the world, he was invested with this almost mythic hero status. He was sort of Superman, just because he wasn't George Bush. and because he was perceived to be a liberal. And yet even his keenest supporters here in the US were amongst the first to admit that he wasn't a great campaigner. He was perhaps a very decent man and a clever man, but not a good communicator, not immediately empathetic with people in a way, say, Bill Clinton would have been. He had no grand plan for Iraq. He had no cure-all for the divisions of the United States. He had no great liberal vision for his country either. And yet, in Europe, he was seen as this hero, the person who had to win. What we at the BBC World Service have to do is try and reflect all those opinions and try to explain them to each other, explain people to each other, but also to question them, to look for the hypocrisy which I think does exist in European thought to a certain extent, to point it out, to challenge policy in the US, challenge policymakers here, but also in the countries with the loudest voices in other parts of the world. And above all, to never forget the real people, the people who all this affects in their everyday lives. And a question that I wanted asked and did ask myself a lot of the time was, okay, you're mad at George Bush, but how would John Kerry make things better? What would be different in, say, Fallujah today, or next April, or this time next year, if John Kerry had won? And I think that's a very sort of sobering thought. You know, the fact is, as Tony Blair said to European leaders after the election, get real. We have the Bush administration, and in Europe we have to learn to work with it and try and understand it. And what we at World Service have to do is try and understand it and explain it to people so that they do understand what's going on here. Thank you very much.
Claire, thank you so much. That was very, very interesting and certainly gives us a different perspective on how Americans are viewed in the rest of the world. I'd like to thank you again and present you with our Adcraft.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.